April 1945. Berlin burns. As Soviet forces tighten their grip around the heart of the Third Reich, Allied intelligence officers begin their systematic investigation of the Führerbunker's innermost chambers. What they discover there will remain classified for decades, a secret so profound it fundamentally alters our understanding of the war itself. Picture the scene. Concrete corridors deep beneath the ruined chancellery, air thick with dampness, and the acrid smell of destruction above. These investigators expect military documents, strategic maps, perhaps personal effects. What they find instead stops them cold. Room after room containing pharmaceutical supplies beyond imagination. 783 different medications, not a modest medicine cabinet, an industrial-scale pharmaceutical arsenal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Consider the implications of that number for a moment. 783 distinct preparations. To put this in perspective, a well-stocked modern pharmacy might carry 2,000 products total, serving an entire community. This was for one man. The leader of Nazi Germany had surrounded himself with more drugs than many hospitals possessed during wartime, but numbers alone cannot capture what these officers encountered. Ampules by the thousands, their glass surfaces catching the dim light of military torches, vials arranged in careful rows, each labelled in precise German script, pills sorted by type and dosage, creating a rainbow of chemical possibility. The investigators moved through these chambers with growing astonishment, photographing, cataloguing, trying to understand what they had stumbled upon. Among the chaos of medications, they found something even more revealing. Hidden in a leather satchel, preserved as if by accident, were the U-proving private records of Dr. Theodor Morell, Hitler's personal physician. These were not the sanitized official documents meant for Reich records. These were the doctor's personal injection logs, day-by-day accounts written in his own hand, detailing 9 years of continuous pharmaceutical intervention. 9 years. Think about that span of time. From 1936 to 1945, through the annexation of Austria, the invasion of Poland, the conquest of France, the assault on the Soviet Union, and finally the collapse of everything the Third Reich claimed to represent. Throughout this entire period, every single day, Hitler received injections. Not occasionally, not when ill, every day. The logs revealed a pattern that defied medical logic. Morning injections before breakfast, afternoon boosters before military conferences, evening doses before public appearances, and often, in the depths of night, emergency injections when the effects of earlier drugs began to wane. Morell's handwriting grew increasingly hurried as the war progressed, his notes more cryptic, but the pattern never varied. The injections continued, day after day, year after year. What were these injections? The Allied medical officers analyzing the records found themselves entering unfamiliar territory. Vitamins, certainly, but also compounds far more concerning. Pervitin appeared repeatedly in the early logs. To modern readers, that name might mean nothing. To pharmacologists, it represents pharmaceutical-grade methamphetamine, the very same chemical compound that today devastates communities and destroys lives, delivered directly into the bloodstream of the man commanding the most powerful military machine in Europe. But Pervitin was merely the beginning. As the investigators continued reading, the cocktail grew darker. Eucodal emerged in the logs from 1941 onwards, prescribed with increasing frequency. This name also requires translation across time. Eucodal was the German pharmaceutical industry's answer to morphine, a synthetic opioid of extraordinary potency. In modern terms, we would recognize it as oxycodone, the same compound at the heart of contemporary addiction crises. Hitler, it seemed, had graduated from stimulants to narcotics. The complexity of the daily regimen staggers the mind. Not simply one drug or another, but combinations carefully timed throughout each day. Stimulants to provide energy and focus during morning briefings. Opioids to smooth the jagged edges of methamphetamine crashes. Cocaine preparations, yes. Cocaine applied to throat and sinuses, ostensibly for medical purposes, but undoubtedly affecting his mental state during crucial hours. Barbiturates to enable sleep after days of chemical stimulation. Hormones, enzymes, exotic preparations made from animal organs. The pharmaceutical kitchen encompassed nearly every category of mind-altering substance available to 1930s and 1940s medicine. Imagine the implications spreading outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Every decision made during those 9 years, every military strategy, every diplomatic negotiation, every furious tirade recorded by witnesses occurred within the context of this chemical manipulation. The orders that sent millions to their deaths, the refusals to allow strategic retreats that doomed entire armies, the increasingly erratic behavior that baffled generals and diplomats alike, all of it filtered through a neurological system saturated with powerful pharmaceuticals. The Allied officers examining these records in that spring of 1945 faced a troubling realization. They had defeated Nazi Germany, yes. They had crushed its military forces, occupied its territory, brought its leaders to justice. But they had been fighting an enemy whose supreme commander had been chemically altered throughout the entire conflict. This was not simply a historical footnote. This was a fundamental recontextualization of how the war unfolded. Consider the weight of this discovery. Historians had spent years analyzing Hitler's strategic decisions, trying to understand the logic behind campaigns that seemed increasingly irrational as the war progressed. Military scholars had written volumes attempting to explain why a leader who showed considerable tactical cunning in the early war years devolved into making decisions that hastened his own defeat. Psychologists had developed elaborate theories about his personality, his ideology, his response to stress and pressure. All of these analyses had occurred without knowledge of the most crucial variable. The brain making those decisions was not operating under normal conditions. It was awash in a pharmaceutical cocktail that would render any person's judgment unreliable. The stimulants alone would produce paranoia, grandiosity, and impaired risk assessment. The opioids would create euphoric detachment from reality, reducing appropriate fear responses. The combination of uppers and downers, administered multiple times daily for years, would generate cognitive effects that medical science was only beginning to understand. The investigators photographed everything, page after page of Morell's logs, shelves upon shelves of medications. They created inventories, cross-referenced dates with historical events, began the painstaking work of reconstruction. But even as they documented this discovery, a decision was made at higher levels of command. This information was too sensitive, too explosive in its implications to be released immediately. Why the secrecy? Consider the context. The world was still processing the full horror of Nazi atrocities. Concentration camps had just been liberated. The scale of the Holocaust was becoming clear. Millions were dead across Europe, cities reduced to rubble, entire populations displaced. In this moment of raw grief and rage, would the revelation that Hitler had been severely addicted to drugs throughout the war be seen as an explanation, or would it be misunderstood as an excuse? The decision was made to classify the findings. The medications were catalogued and stored. Morell's logs were sealed away in intelligence archives. The officers who made the discovery were instructed to maintain silence. For decades, this information would remain hidden, known only to a small circle of intelligence officials and historians with appropriate clearances. But secrets of this magnitude cannot remain buried forever. Documents have a way of surfacing. Archives eventually open. Witnesses eventually speak. And as the years passed, as the raw emotions of the immediate post-war period cooled into historical perspective, researchers began to uncover fragments of this story. A reference in one document, a footnote in another, testimony from a surviving member of Hitler's inner circle mentioning the constant injections. Slowly, piece by piece, the full picture began to emerge. What those Allied investigators discovered in April 1945 was not simply a collection of drugs. They had found the chemical key to understanding one of history's darkest chapters. They had stumbled upon evidence that the Second World War, a conflict that killed more than 70 million people, reshaped the entire global order and defined the 20th century, had been directed, at least in part, by a leader whose judgment was severely compromised by chronic drug addiction. This was not the war we thought we knew. This was something far more disturbing, far more complex, and far more human in its tragedy. A man, a doctor, a chemical dependency, and the collision of these intimate factors with the vast machinery of total war. The 783 medications sat in their orderly rows, silent witnesses to a truth that would take the world decades to fully comprehend. In that bunker, in the spring of 1945, the hidden history of World War II waited to be told. To understand how Adolf Hitler became one of history's most notorious drug addicts, we must first understand the man who enabled that addiction. Theodor Morell did not begin as a villain. He began, like so many architects of tragedy, as an ambitious professional seeking success in troubled times. Berlin, 1923. The Weimar Republic staggers under impossible economic burdens. Hyperinflation has rendered the German mark nearly worthless. A loaf of bread costs billions. Life savings evaporate overnight. In this chaos, Theodor Morell establishes his medical practice on the fashionable Kurfürstendamm Boulevard, catering to Berlin's elite who can still afford private healthcare. Morell possessed certain advantages. He had studied in Paris and Munich, gaining expertise in what was then called electrotherapy, using electrical current to treat various ailments. More importantly, he had developed a talent that transcended medical skill. He understood how to make wealthy, anxious people feel cared for. He listened attentively. He prescribed confidently. He projected an aura of scientific authority, combined with personal warmth that made patients trust him implicitly. His practice flourished. Actors, industrialists, politicians, Berlin's upper classes sought his services. He became particularly known for vitamin injections, a relatively new and fashionable treatment. Vitamins themselves had only been isolated and identified in the previous 2 decades. The idea that one could receive concentrated doses directly into the bloodstream felt modern, scientific, almost magical. Morell capitalized on this enthusiasm, developing his own proprietary vitamin preparations and administering them with the confidence of a man who believed absolutely in his methods. But Theodor Morell harbored larger ambitions than merely tending to wealthy Berliners. He wanted significance. He wanted to be recognized as more than a society doctor. He wanted, though he might not have articulated it so clearly even to himself, to be indispensable to power. Opportunity arrived through a chain of seemingly random connections. Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer, suffered from a venereal disease that conventional doctors had failed to cure. Someone recommended Morell. The treatment succeeded, or at least Hoffmann believed it succeeded, which in the world of medicine can amount to the same thing. Hoffmann, grateful and impressed, began speaking enthusiastically about his doctor to everyone in his circle, including Adolf Hitler. Hitler in 1936 was not the trembling, deteriorating figure of the bunker years. He was 57 years old, energetic, seemingly healthy, yet he suffered from various complaints that troubled him: chronic stomach pain, excessive flatulence, skin problems, insomnia. He had consulted numerous physicians without finding lasting relief. His hypochondria was well known to his inner circle. He obsessed over his health, studying medical texts, proposing his own diagnoses, often rejecting treatments that conventional doctors prescribed. When Hoffmann suggested Morell, Hitler was skeptical. Theodor Morell did not look the part of a distinguished physician. He was overweight, sometimes careless about personal hygiene, prone to sweating profusely. Other members of Hitler's inner circle took one look at him and dismissed him as a charlatan. But Hitler, always unpredictable in his judgments, decided to give the doctor a chance. Their first meeting occurred at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps. Morell listened as Hitler described his symptoms. Where other doctors had been tentative or had suggested that some complaints might be psychosomatic, Morell expressed absolute certainty. He knew exactly what was wrong, he announced. More importantly, he knew exactly how to fix it. He began with vitamin injections, not the standard preparations available at any pharmacy, but his own formulations, mixed according to proprietary recipes he claimed were superior to anything else available. Hitler received his first injection in September 1936. The effect was immediate and, from Hitler's perspective, miraculous. He felt energized, clear-headed, ready to face the demanding schedule of the Reich's leader. Within days, he declared Morell a genius. This response set the template for everything that followed. Morell had discovered something more valuable than any medical technique. He had discovered that his patient craved immediate noticeable effects. Hitler did not have patience for treatments that worked slowly or subtly. He wanted to feel different, to feel better, to feel enhanced. And Morell was prepared to deliver that sensation by whatever means necessary. The vitamin injections continued, becoming a daily ritual. But vitamins alone, even in high doses, have limited effects. The dramatic improvements Hitler reported suggest that something else was entering those syringes even in the early days. Morell's private notes, discovered decades later, reveal the truth. Small amounts of stimulants were being added to the vitamin preparations. Not enough to be immediately obvious, just enough to produce the energizing effect Hitler craved. This was the crucial first step down a long, dark staircase. Hitler did not know he was receiving stimulants. He believed the remarkable energy came from vitamins, from Morell's superior medical knowledge, from the doctor's ability to understand his unique constitution. Each injection reinforced his dependence, not just physically, but psychologically. He had found a doctor who made him feel extraordinary. Why would he ever seek anyone else? Morell's position at the center of power opened other opportunities. He began acquiring pharmaceutical companies across Germany and, later, occupied territories. What started as a medical practice evolved into an industrial empire. He produced medications, vitamin preparations, hormones, and countless other products. His factories operated in Czechoslovakia, Poland, the Netherlands. The conquered territories of the Third Reich became, among their many tragic purposes, sources of pharmaceutical wealth for Hitler's doctor. The symbiotic relationship deepened year by year. Hitler grew more dependent on the injections, more convinced that Morell alone understood his body's needs. Morell, in turn, became utterly dependent on Hitler's patronage. His business empire existed only through the Führer's protection. His status, his wealth, his significance, all derived from that single patient. Neither man could afford to lose the other. Other doctors around Hitler watched this relationship with growing alarm. They could see that Morell's treatments were excessive, that the constant injections were unhealthy, that Hitler's appearance and behavior were changing in concerning ways. Dr. Karl Brandt, Hitler's official Reich physician, attempted to intervene multiple times. He was ignored. Professor Theo Morell had become untouchable. The turning point came in 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, began in June. Hitler moved to the Wolfschanz, the Wolf's Lair, his military headquarters in East Prussia. The demands on his time and energy multiplied exponentially. He presided over military conferences that lasted hours, receiving reports from multiple fronts, making decisions that affected millions of soldiers and civilians. He slept less, ate irregularly, and drove himself to exhaustion day after day. Morel saw his patient struggling and made a fateful decision. The vitamin injections with their mild stimulant additions were no longer sufficient. Hitler needed something stronger to maintain his superhuman schedule. Morel reached for Pervitin. Pervitin tablets had been issued to German soldiers earlier in the war, helping them maintain alertness during long marches and combat operations. The German military had given methamphetamine to its troops by the millions of doses, particularly during the lightning campaigns in Poland and France. Now, Morel decided the Führer himself needed this chemical assistance. The escalation happened gradually at first. A few Pervitin tablets to help with fatigue, then more tablets to sustain energy through longer days. Then, inevitably, injections, because injections worked faster, hit harder, produced more dramatic effects. Hitler felt invincible on Pervitin. He could work 20-hour days without flagging. His confidence soared. His natural tendency toward grandiose thinking expanded into something approaching delusion. But he felt magnificent, and that was all that mattered. Morel documented everything in his private logs, but with increasing circumspection. He used abbreviations, coded references, vague descriptions. He knew that what he was doing had crossed medical boundaries. He knew that other doctors, if they discovered the full extent of the pharmaceutical intervention, would condemn it as dangerous quackery at best, criminal negligence at worst. So he kept his detailed records hidden, sharing only sanitized versions with Reich medical officials. The relationship between doctor and patient had transformed into something resembling a drug dealer and addict, though neither man would have used those terms. Morel told himself he was providing necessary medical treatment to a leader bearing unbearable burdens. Hitler told himself he was receiving scientifically advanced therapies that enhanced his natural abilities. Both men were lying to themselves, and perhaps, at some level, both knew it. By 1942, the injections had become so frequent and the preparations so complex that Morel was essentially running a mobile pharmacy. He travelled everywhere with Hitler, bringing cases full of ampules, vials, and pills. He had become as indispensable as any military advisor, perhaps more so. Hitler could conduct the war without any particular general, but he could not function without his injections. Other members of Hitler's inner circle watched this dependency with mixed feelings. Some were genuinely concerned about the Führer's health. Others recognized that Morel's influence could be exploited, tell the doctor what Hitler should hear, and he would whisper it at opportune moments. A few, more perceptive or cynical, understood that the injections were changing Hitler in fundamental ways, but they said nothing. One does not criticize the Führer's chosen physician and expect to survive the accusation of disloyalty. Morel himself had no illusions about his position's precariousness. He knew that other doctors schemed against him, that powerful figures would gladly see him dismissed if they could convince Hitler to make that decision. His survival depended on maintaining Hitler's absolute trust and continued dependency. So the injections continued, the doses increased, and new preparations were added to the daily cocktail whenever Hitler seemed to need additional chemical support. The irony of this situation would become apparent only later. The Third Reich built its ideology on notions of racial purity, physical perfection, and the elimination of those deemed weak or defective. Yet its supreme leader was being kept functional through constant pharmaceutical intervention by a doctor whose methods would have been considered highly questionable by any medical standards. The champion of strength was chemically dependent. The prophet of purity was polluted with powerful drugs. The leader who sent millions to death was himself slowly being destroyed by the very treatments he believed were keeping him alive. Theodor Morel did not set out to become the enabler of catastrophe. He set out to be a successful doctor, to gain wealth and recognition, to matter in the world. He found his opportunity and seized it. The path from vitamin injections to hardcore narcotics was not a single decision, but a series of small steps, each seeming justified in the moment. By the time the magnitude of what he had done became clear, there was no turning back. He was trapped by his own success, bound to his patient by chains of mutual dependency, riding the tiger of power toward an inevitable disaster neither man could escape. The relationship between Hitler and Morell reveals something profound about the nature of addiction and enablement. It requires two participants, each receiving something they desperately want. The addict receives the chemical alteration they crave. The enabler receives significance, security, and purpose. Both are locked in a dance that neither can stop, even when they can see it leading toward destruction. In this case, that destruction would encompass not just two men, but an entire continent, and reverberate through generations yet unborn. The transformation did not happen overnight. It occurred gradually, inexorably, like a slow-motion collapse that everyone around Hitler witnessed but few dared acknowledge. By 1943, the man directing Germany's war effort bore little resemblance to the vigorous leader who had stood before crowds just a few years earlier, and the cause of this deterioration was flowing into his veins multiple times every single day. Let us trace the chemical descent with precision, because the details matter. They reveal not just what happened, but how addiction progresses, how tolerance builds, how the brain's chemistry becomes so altered that normal function becomes impossible without pharmaceutical support. In the beginning, back in 1936 and 37, the regimen was relatively modest. One injection in the morning, perhaps another in the afternoon if Hitler faced a particularly demanding day. The preparations contained vitamins that much was true, but also small amounts of stimulants that Morell never explicitly acknowledged. Hitler felt energized, focused, capable. He attributed these feelings to the vitamins and to Morell's medical genius. The deception was complete, and perhaps Morell even deceived himself about what he was doing, but the body adapts. This is the fundamental tragedy of stimulant use. The brain, flooded repeatedly with chemicals that force the release of dopamine and norepinephrine, begins to adjust. It reduces the number of receptors. It becomes less sensitive to normal stimulation. What once produced a powerful effect now produces a mild one. The user requires more of the drug to achieve the same sensation. This is not weakness or moral failure. This is biology, remorseless and predictable. By 1940, Hitler needed more frequent injections. 2 became 3, 3 became 4. The amounts per injection increased. Morell's notes record the escalation with clinical precision, though his later efforts to conceal the records suggest he understood how damning they were. The vitamin cover story wore increasingly thin. Hitler was not receiving enhanced nutrition. He was receiving pharmaceutical-grade methamphetamine on a schedule that would have alarmed any physician not personally profiting from the arrangement. Then came Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, and with it, the crossing of a crucial threshold. The invasion of the Soviet Union was the largest military operation in human history. 4 million Axis troops poured across the border. The front stretched nearly 3,000 kilometers. The logistical complexity staggered comprehension. Hitler, as supreme commander, attempted to oversee all of it personally. He insisted on approving tactical decisions that should have been left to field commanders. He studied maps for hours, memorized unit designations, demanded constant updates from every sector. No human being could sustain that level of focus and engagement without chemical assistance. Hitler's natural sleep pattern had always been erratic, but now sleep became almost impossible. 4 hours, 3 hours, sometimes less. His body screamed for rest. His mind, saturated with stimulants, refused to allow it. Morell found himself called upon at all hours to administer injections that would keep Hitler functioning for just a few more hours of conferences and decisions. The Pervitin doses escalated dramatically. What had been measured in milligrams now approached amounts that would be considered dangerous by any medical standard. But Morel had long since abandoned any pretense of following medical standards. He was not treating a patient according to best practices. He was managing an addiction, keeping his patient functional enough to maintain the symbiotic relationship they both required. It was during this period that Ukudal entered the picture. Hitler had always suffered from digestive problems, but the massive doses of methamphetamine made them worse. Stimulants suppress appetite and can cause severe gastrointestinal distress. Hitler experienced terrible cramping, bloating, pain. He could barely eat. His already strict vegetarian diet became even more restricted. Morel needed a solution. Opioids relax smooth muscle and reduce pain. They also produce euphoria, confidence, and a sense of well-being that can counter the paranoia and agitation caused by excessive stimulant use. Ukudal synthetic oxycodone became Morel's answer to the problems created by his earlier treatments. He was now using one class of powerful drugs to counteract the side effects of another class of powerful drugs, while the patient descended deeper into a pharmaceutical prison. Understand what this combination does to human consciousness. Methamphetamine floods the brain with dopamine, creating intense focus, energy, and confidence, but also paranoia, aggression, and impaired judgment. Opioids produce calm, euphoria, and pain relief, but also detachment from reality and impaired emotional processing. Together, these chemicals create a mental state, unlike either drug alone, a kind of energized dissociation where the user feels supremely confident and clear-headed while actually being neither. Hitler began making decisions in this altered state. Not occasionally, every day. Every decision from mid-1941 onward occurred in a brain chemistry that bore no resemblance to normal function. The orders he issued, the strategies he approved, the rages he directed at generals who suggested retreat or caution, all of it, filtered through a neurological system awash in contradictory chemicals. The visible changes alarmed everyone around him. His hands developed a persistent tremor. His left arm began shaking uncontrollably during stressful moments. His posture, once rigidly erect, developed a stooped quality. His skin took on an unhealthy pallor. His eyes, always intense, now had a quality that witnesses struggled to describe simultaneously bright and dead, focused and vacant. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and armaments minister, later recorded his observations of this transformation. He described Hitler's increasing difficulty in making coherent decisions. Military conferences that once featured sharp exchanges of ideas now devolved into rambling monologues where Hitler would fixate on minor details while ignoring strategic realities. His memory, once formidable, became unreliable. He would insist things had been said that were never spoken, deny conversations that multiple witnesses remembered clearly. The military commanders noticed the change most acutely. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and Colonel General Alfred Jodl, who attended Hitler's daily military briefings, watched their supreme commander's mental state deteriorate month by month. Orders became increasingly divorced from battlefield realities. Hitler would study maps and move pins representing divisions, but the divisions existed only in his drugged imagination. They had been destroyed weeks earlier. He would demand offensives from armies that no longer had the strength to attack, insist on holding positions that could not be held, and refuse to authorize retreats that might have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. General Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's most accomplished tank commanders, confronted this reality repeatedly. He would present careful analysis of battlefield situations, explain with maps and statistics why a particular course of action was necessary, only to have Hitler dismiss everything with a wave of his hand. The Führer would then launch into lengthy explanations of why the situation was not as it appeared, why his intuition superseded any factual analysis. Why Germany would triumph if everyone simply obeyed his orders without question. Was this simply dictatorial arrogance? The refusal to accept unwelcome facts is certainly a trait of authoritarian leaders, but the testimony of those who knew Hitler before the heavy drug use suggests something more. They describe a man who, whatever his ideological madness, had possessed considerable tactical intelligence in the war's early years. That intelligence did not simply vanish. It was drowned in chemicals that made rational thought increasingly difficult. The cocaine preparations deserve special attention. Morel began administering cocaine drops to Hitler's throat and sinuses, ostensibly to treat chronic infections. Cocaine is a powerful local anesthetic, so it would indeed numb pain. But cocaine applied to mucous membranes also enters the bloodstream and crosses into the brain. It produces a rush of confidence, reduces fatigue, and can create feelings of invincibility. It is also highly psychologically addictive. Hitler began requesting these cocaine applications multiple times per day, before important meetings, before public speeches, before military conferences where he expected resistance to his decisions. The pattern is clear in Morel's records. Cocaine became not a medical treatment, but a performance-enhancing drug used whenever Hitler needed to project strength and certainty. Picture a typical day in Hitler's life by 1943. He wakes after a few hours of chemically induced sleep, the barbiturates Morel gave him the night before still clouding his mind. Morel arrives with the morning injection vitamins mixed with methamphetamine to jumpstart the day. Within minutes, Hitler feels the fog lift, replaced by a sharp, jittery energy. He eats a meager breakfast, his appetite suppressed by the stimulants. Mid-morning brings a military conference. As it begins, Hitler's nose and throat receive cocaine drops. The meeting proceeds with Hitler dominating every discussion, his confidence absolute, his willingness to hear contrary opinions non-existent. The generals leave frustrated, carrying orders they know are unwise or impossible, but unable to convince their commander to reconsider. Afternoon arrives, and with it, the first signs of the morning's chemicals wearing off. Hitler feels agitated, irritable. Morel administers another injection, more methamphetamine, possibly mixed with glucose to provide energy. The boost is temporary. By early evening, Hitler's body is exhausted despite his chemically fueled mind. Here comes the Eucadal. The opioid washes over him, smoothing the jagged edges of the stimulant crash. Pain fades. Anxiety dissolves. For a few hours he feels calm, even content. He might watch a film or talk with his secretaries, his mood elevated by the drugs coursing through his system. But night brings the inevitable reckoning. The day's drug cocktail has left his body depleted and his brain chemistry chaotic. Sleep is impossible without chemical assistance. Morel provides barbiturates, powerful sedatives that force unconsciousness. Hitler crashes into a few hours of troubled rest, and the cycle begins again the next morning. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, the cumulative effect of this pharmaceutical assault is devastating. Chronic methamphetamine use damages dopamine neurons, creating permanent changes in the brain's reward system. Chronic opioid use alters pain, perception, and emotional regulation in ways that persist long after the drugs are discontinued. The combination of stimulants, opioids, cocaine, and barbiturates creates a neurological catastrophe, a brain that cannot function normally even if the drugs were suddenly stopped, but also cannot function normally while the drugs continue. Hitler's physical appearance by 1944 shocked those who had not seen him recently. His face was puffy from edema, his movements were stiff and uncertain. The tremor in his left hand had become so pronounced that he often held his right hand over it to conceal the shaking. He walked with a shuffle, his back bent. At 55 years old, he moved like a man of 80. Film footage from this period captures the deterioration with brutal clarity. Watch Hitler greet a group of Hitler Youth in one of the war's final months. His left arm hangs useless at his side. His right hand shakes visibly as he pats a boy's cheek. His eyes have a glassy quality. His smile, once commanding cameras and crowds, now appears as a grimace. This is not the robust dictator of the newsreels from 1939. This is a man being destroyed from within by chemicals he believes are keeping him alive. The tragedy extends beyond Hitler himself. Every person whose life depended on his decisions, and in total war, that meant millions suffered the consequences of his addiction. Soldiers died following orders issued by a commander whose judgment was severely impaired. Civilians perished in cities. Hitler insisted on holding for purely symbolic reasons that made sense only to his drug-altered consciousness. The war itself, which might have ended sooner with different leadership decisions, ground on for months longer than necessary, claiming additional hundreds of thousands of lives. Morell continued administering his injections until nearly the end. In the bunker, during the final days, as Soviet artillery shells exploded overhead and the Third Reich collapsed into rubble, Hitler still received his daily pharmaceutical cocktail. The injections had become so routine that they continued even when their purpose maintaining Hitler's ability to lead had become entirely moot. The addiction persisted beyond any rational justification, a testament to the power of chemical dependency to survive even the destruction of everything around it. One must ask, did Morell understand what he had done? His later testimony suggests a man who had convinced himself that his treatments were medically justified, that he was supporting a leader bearing impossible burdens. But his careful concealment of records, his evasive coding in his notes, his refusal to allow other doctors access to his preparations, all of this suggests awareness that his actions could not bear scrutiny. The descent into chemical madness was complete. The man directing one of history's most consequential wars was doing so in a state of consciousness that bore no resemblance to sobriety. The decisions shaping the fate of nations came from a mind saturated with methamphetamine, opioids, cocaine, and barbiturates. And the world paid the price for this pharmaceutical catastrophe in blood and ash and grief beyond measure. History remembers battles as clashes of strategy and courage, of brilliant maneuvers and heroic stands. But what happens when the commander making life and death decisions is under the influence of powerful narcotics? What happens when orders that doom thousands of soldiers originate in a mind clouded by methamphetamine and opioids? Let us examine specific moments where drugs may have altered the course of the war itself. Dunkirk, May 1940. The British Expeditionary Force and French armies are trapped against the Channel coast. German panzer divisions have broken through and could potentially destroy the entire Allied force. Victory seems inevitable. Then Hitler issues an order that baffles his generals. Halt the advance. Stop the tanks. Allow the infantry to catch up. The order makes no tactical sense, and in the crucial days that follow, over 300,000 Allied soldiers escape across the Channel to fight another day. Military historians have debated this decision for decades. Some cite Hitler's fear of extending his armoured units too far. Others suggest he hoped to negotiate peace with Britain and wanted to avoid humiliating them completely. But Morell's records from those days reveal something else. Hitler received unusually large doses of cocaine preparations during this period, ostensibly for a throat condition. Cocaine produces euphoria and overconfidence, but it also impairs judgment and creates a sense that careful deliberation is unnecessary. The halt order at Dunkirk may represent one of history's most consequential drug-influenced decisions. General Heinz Guderian, whose tanks were stopped just as victory appeared certain, later described his fury and incomprehension. He had the enemy cornered, he had the momentum, and then came the inexplicable command to stop. When he protested, he was told the Führer's decision was final. Guderian did not know that Hitler's throat had been treated with cocaine drops shortly before issuing that order. He did not know that his supreme commander was making decisions in an altered state of consciousness. He knew only that a golden opportunity was slipping away. Move forward to December 1942, Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army, nearly 300,000 men, is surrounded by Soviet forces. General Friedrich Paulus requests permission to attempt a breakout while his army still has the strength to fight its way through the encirclement. The request reaches Hitler at the Wolf's Lair. By this time, Hitler's daily regimen includes multiple injections of Eucodal, the powerful opioid that Morel has been administering with increasing frequency. Opioids create a dangerous sense of detachment. Pain seems distant. Consequences feel abstract. Problems that should generate appropriate anxiety instead produce a kind of dreamy indifference. Hitler, studying maps while under the influence of synthetic heroin, decides that the Sixth Army will hold its position. No retreat, no surrender. The order is absolute. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding the relief effort, pleaded for reconsideration. Other generals added their voices. The military reality was clear. The Sixth Army would be destroyed if it did not withdraw. But Hitler, cushioned by opioids from the appropriate fear response that the situation demanded, refused to budge. The army would hold. Germany did not retreat. The decision was final. What followed was one of the war's greatest disasters. The Sixth Army held its positions as ordered. Soviet forces tightened the noose. Supplies dwindled. Winter descended with savage cold. Men froze and starved. By February 1943, over 90,000 German soldiers had been killed, and the survivors marched into Soviet captivity. Of those, only 6,000 would ever see Germany again. Did opioids make the difference? Could Hitler have made the same decision while sober? Perhaps. His ideology certainly contributed to the no-retreat mentality, but testimony from those present at the military conferences describes Hitler's strange calm when discussing Stalingrad, his seeming inability to grasp the catastrophe unfolding. This emotional blunting, this disconnect between reality and response, is precisely what opioids produce. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Hitler conceives a desperate gamble, a massive offensive through the Belgian forests, aiming to split the Allied armies and capture Antwerp. The plan requires surprise, perfect weather, and resources Germany no longer possesses. His generals are skeptical, to the point of despair, but Hitler insists the offensive will succeed through sheer willpower and audacity. Morel's records from this period show the pharmaceutical cocktail reaching its peak complexity: morning methamphetamine injections, afternoon cocaine applications, evening Eucodal, barbiturates for sleep, glucose injections for energy, hormone preparations. The list grows longer by the day. Hitler's consciousness has become a chemically managed state, maintained by constant pharmaceutical intervention. The Battle of the Bulge begins on December 16th. The initial attack achieves surprise, and German forces push forward. For a few days, Hitler's confidence seems justified, but the offensive has been conceived in a drug-fueled delusion about Germany's remaining capabilities. The reality asserts itself quickly. The weather clears, allowing Allied air superiority to dominate. Fuel runs out. Reinforcements cannot arrive. By early January, the offensive has failed completely, consuming Germany's last meaningful reserves in a gamble that never had any real chance of success. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding one of the panzer armies in the Ardennes, later described the eerie quality of Hitler's orders during this period. They reflected no understanding of actual battlefield conditions. They assumed capabilities that did not exist. They displayed a disconnect from reality that Manteuffel struggled to explain, having no knowledge of the pharmaceutical fog in which these orders originated. Consider the cumulative effect across hundreds of such decisions, large and small. Not every order can be directly linked to specific drug doses, but all of Hitler's strategic thinking from 1941 onward occurred in a brain chemistry that was fundamentally altered. The refusal to allow tactical retreats that might have saved encircled forces. The insistence on holding cities for symbolic rather than strategic reasons. The belief that willpower and faith could overcome material disadvantages. The paranoid purges of commanders who suggested realistic assessments. All of this filtered through consciousness, shaped by stimulants and opioids. General Gotthard Heinrici, who commanded Army Group Vistula in the war's final months, witnessed Hitler's decision-making during the desperate defense of Berlin. He described conferences where Hitler would move phantom divisions on maps, issuing orders to units that no longer existed. The field marshal would attempt to explain reality, only to have Hitler dismiss his concerns with absolute confidence. Heinrici later learned about Hitler's drug use and found the puzzle pieces falling into place. The inexplicable decisions suddenly had an explanation. The military cost was staggering, but measuring it precisely is impossible. How many soldiers died following orders that a sober commander might not have issued? How many battles were lost due to strategy conceived in a methamphetamine haze? How many opportunities for ending the war earlier were squandered by a leader whose judgment was chemically compromised? We can never know the exact numbers, but we can understand the principle. Leadership in war requires clear judgment, appropriate assessment of risk, ability to accept unwelcome truths, and willingness to adapt strategy to changing circumstances. Drug addiction undermines every one of these capabilities. Stimulants produce overconfidence and paranoia. Opioids create emotional detachment and impaired risk assessment. The combination ensures that decisions will be worse than they would be under normal consciousness. The generals and field marshals who served under Hitler found themselves in an impossible position. They could see the deterioration in their commander's judgment, but few understood its pharmaceutical cause. Those who did understand kept silent, fearing accusations of disloyalty. To question, Hitler's mental state was to risk everything, so they executed orders they knew were mistaken, watched armies be destroyed following strategies they knew were flawed, and bore witness to a military catastrophe enabled by addiction. The testimony of these commanders, given in prisoner of war interviews and later memoirs, creates a consistent picture. Hitler's decision-making changed dramatically as the war progressed. Early campaigns showed real tactical intelligence, whatever one thinks of the overall moral catastrophe. Later decisions showed increasing rigidity, irrationality, and detachment from reality. The timeline of this decline matches almost precisely the timeline of pharmaceutical escalation documented in Morell's hidden records. When drugs decided battles, soldiers paid with their lives. The tragedy extends beyond Hitler himself, beyond even the generals forced to implement his orders. It touches every person who fell in combat executing strategies conceived by a commander whose consciousness was dominated by methamphetamine and synthetic heroin. Their sacrifice deserves recognition not just as the cost of war, but as the cost of addiction at the highest levels of power. The pills and injections that Hitler believed were giving him strength were actually ensuring disaster, one pharmaceutical dose at a time. The war ended in May 1945, but the investigation into Hitler's pharmaceutical dependency had only just begun. What Allied intelligence officers discovered in the bunker was merely the first layer of a truth that would take decades to fully excavate. The process of understanding what had happened resembled archaeological work, carefully brushing away layers of secrecy, deception, and denial to reveal the evidence beneath. The American and British intelligence services approached the mystery from different angles, but with the same fundamental questions. How long had this been happening? How extensive was the drug use? And most importantly, how much did it affect Hitler's leadership during the war? The answers would emerge slowly, pieced together from captured documents, interrogations, and careful analysis of historical records that suddenly made sense in this new pharmaceutical context. Theodore Morell became a person of intense interest. American forces captured him in May 1945, finding him attempting to blend into the chaos of defeated Germany. He was not a war criminal in the conventional sense. He had not ordered atrocities or commanded military forces, but he held information that intelligence analysts desperately wanted. What had he been giving Hitler? For how long? In what quantities? The interrogations began cautiously. Morell was in poor health himself, suffering from obesity and various ailments. He was also terrified, understanding that his association with Hitler made him vulnerable to prosecution despite his lack of direct involvement in war crimes. The interrogators had to balance extracting information against the risk that Morell would simply refuse to cooperate or claim medical inability to continue. Initially, Morell maintained the fiction that his treatments had been medically sound. He emphasized the vitamin injections, the glucose preparations, the various tonics designed to support a leader bearing enormous stress. When asked about the more exotic preparations, he became evasive. He claimed medical necessity. He insisted everything was documented according to proper medical protocols, but the physical evidence contradicted his testimony. The 783 medications found in the bunker demanded explanation. Morell's private injection logs, once investigators learned to decode his abbreviations and medical shorthand, revealed a pharmaceutical regimen that no legitimate doctor would have prescribed. Confronted with this evidence, Morell's story began to change. He admitted, gradually and reluctantly, to administering stimulants. But he framed it as occasional use, medically justified to help Hitler maintain the demanding schedule of wartime leadership. He minimized the doses and frequency. He insisted that he had always acted in his patient's best interests. The interrogators pressed harder, showing him his own records, pointing out contradictions in his testimony. Morell's defenses crumbled piece by piece. What emerged was a portrait of a doctor who had lost all medical judgment in the service of maintaining his position and pleasing his patient. Morell admitted that Hitler had craved the injections, had become psychologically and physically dependent on them, had demanded them with increasing frequency. He claimed he had tried to reduce the doses, but that Hitler would not permit it. This testimony, self-serving though it was, provided crucial confirmation that addiction had indeed occurred. The British intelligence services pursued a different line of investigation. They focused on film footage and photographs of Hitler from throughout the war years, conducting systematic analysis of his physical appearance and behavior. They recruited medical experts to study this visual evidence, looking for signs of drug abuse that would be recognizable to trained observers. The findings were striking. Early footage from the 1930s showed a man with normal motor control, steady hands, or fluid movements. By 1943, the changes were undeniable. The left-hand tremor appeared prominently in many scenes. Hitler's gait showed the shuffling quality associated with neurological damage. His facial expressions showed reduced range, a kind of masked quality that can result from various forms of brain dysfunction. His pupils in many photographs appeared dilated, consistent with stimulant use. Perhaps most tellingly, the footage showed behavioral signs of addiction. Hitler displayed what medical experts identified as drug-seeking behavior. The anxious glances toward Morell during long conferences, the visible relief after receiving injections, the agitation when treatments were delayed. These patterns, invisible to casual viewers, were unmistakable to specialists analyzing the footage specifically for signs of pharmaceutical dependency. The inner circle members who survived the war became another crucial source of information. Hitler's secretaries, his bodyguards, the adjutants and valets who served him daily. These people had witnessed the pharmaceutical routine firsthand. Even if they had not understood its full implications at the time, their testimony, collected through hundreds of hours of interviews, created a detailed picture of Hitler's daily life and the role that Morell's injections played in it. Junge, one of Hitler's personal secretaries, described how the Führer's mood would transform after his morning injection with Morell. The irritability and fatigue that marked his waking hours would vanish, replaced by focused energy. She had not questioned it at the time, assuming it was simply the effect of necessary medical treatment. Only later did she understand that she had been watching the daily ritual of addiction and chemical management. Heinz Linge, Hitler's valet, provided even more intimate details. He described Hitler's insistence on the precise timing of injections, his anxiety if Morell was delayed, his physical discomfort during the hours between doses. Linge recalled evenings when Hitler seemed unable to sit still, pacing endlessly, only to become calm and almost serene after Morell administered an injection. These observations, collected from someone who lacked medical training, nevertheless described the classic pattern of opioid addiction and relief. The Nazi regime had been meticulous in its documentation, and this bureaucratic thoroughness now served historical investigation. Medical records from various sources began to surface, not Morell's hidden personal logs, but official documents from military, hospitals, reports from other physicians who had examined Hitler, pharmaceutical requisition forms from the Reich chancellery. Each document added another piece to the puzzle. One particularly revealing find was a report from Dr. Erwin Giesing, an ear, nose and throat specialist who had treated Hitler in 1944 after the July 20th assassination attempt. Giesing had been shocked by what he observed. Hitler's nose and throat showed damage consistent with chronic cocaine application. His pupils reacted abnormally to light. His behavior showed signs of what Giesing recognized as drug intoxication, though he had not known the full extent of Morell's regimen. Giesing had attempted to discuss his concerns with other doctors in Hitler's circle, only to be shut down. He had even tried to convince Hitler to reduce his reliance on Morell's treatments, which led to his dismissal from the inner circle. His testimony, given to Allied investigators, confirmed that multiple doctors had recognized signs of pharmaceutical abuse, but had been unable to intervene against Morell's monopoly on Hitler's medical care. The classified nature of these findings became a source of controversy within intelligence circles. Some argued that the information should be released immediately, that the world deserved to know that Hitler had been severely drug addicted during the war. Others insisted on continued classification, fearing that the revelation might be misunderstood as an excuse for Nazi crimes or might complicate war crimes prosecutions. The decision was made to keep the most sensitive details classified. The official history of the war would record Hitler's deteriorating health, his erratic behavior, his poor decision-making in later years. But the specific pharmaceutical details, the extent of the addiction, the direct connection between drug use and military disasters, these elements would remain in sealed archives, accessible only to researchers with appropriate security clearances. Decades passed. The immediate post-war period gave way to the Cold War. The participants in these events aged and died, taking their memories with them. But the documents remained, patient and unchanging in their storage facilities. And gradually, as classification periods expired and archives opened, researchers began to access the material that told the full story. German historian Werner Maser published findings in the 1970s that hinted at the pharmaceutical angle, though he lacked access to the most detailed records. British journalist and author Hugh Trevor Roper incorporated some references to Hitler's drug use in his analysis of the dictator's final days, but the complete picture remained obscured, fragments scattered across different archives in multiple countries. The real breakthrough came as Cold War classifications expired and previously sealed documents became available to researchers. Suddenly, Morell's detailed logs were accessible. The interrogation transcripts were released. The medical analyses of film footage were declassified. For the first time, historians could see the full scope of what had occurred. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. The drug use had started earlier than previously understood. The doses were larger, the variety of substances was more extensive. Most significantly, the pharmaceutical intervention had been more continuous and pervasive than even pessimistic estimates had suggested. Hitler had not simply used drugs occasionally, or in the war's final desperate years. He had been under constant pharmaceutical influence for nearly a decade, including the entire duration of World War II. This revelation sent shockwaves through the historical community. It required reassessing virtually every aspect of Hitler's wartime leadership. Decisions that had been attributed to ideology, to strategic calculation, or to psychological factors now had to be considered in light of chronic drug addiction. The man who had shaped the mid-20th century had been chemically impaired while doing so. The unraveling truth changed how we understand that terrible period. It did not excuse the crimes, nothing could do that, but it added a dimension that had been missing from every previous analysis. The human factor, in its most literal pharmaceutical sense, had been shaping events all along. The pills and injections that Hitler believed were giving him strength had instead been clouding his judgment, impairing his decision-making, and contributing to decisions that prolonged the war and increased its human cost. The investigation that began in a bunker in April 1945 had finally reached its conclusion. The truth, hidden for decades behind classification stamps and archival restrictions, was now visible in its terrible entirety. Hitler had been an addict, Morell had been his enabler, and the world had paid the price for their pharmaceutical collaboration. The 21st century brought new tools to bear on old mysteries, technologies that did not exist when Allied investigators first examined Hitler's pharmaceutical arsenal now allowed researchers to analyze the evidence with unprecedented precision. Neuroscience, pharmacology, and computer modeling combined to answer questions that previous generations of historians could only speculate about. Consider what modern pharmacology can tell us about the specific drug combinations Hitler received. We are no longer limited to saying simply that he used methamphetamine and opioids. We can now model exactly how these substances interact in the human brain, how they affect neural pathways, how they alter decision-making processes at the molecular level. Methamphetamine works by forcing massive release of dopamine and norepinephrine. These neurotransmitters create feelings of energy, confidence, and focus. But the effect is not neutral. The brain's reward system becomes hijacked, normal. Pleasures lose their appeal. Risk assessment becomes distorted. The user develops what researchers call incentive salience, an overwhelming focus on obtaining more of the drug, while other concerns fade into insignificance. Now add opioids to this chemical mixture. Eucodal, the synthetic oxycodone that Morell administered with increasing frequency, acts on completely different neural pathways. It binds to mu-opioid receptors, producing analgesia and euphoria. It suppresses the stress response. It creates emotional blunting, a reduced ability to feel appropriate anxiety or fear in dangerous situations. Modern pharmacological analysis reveals that this combination is particularly dangerous for decision-making. The stimulants create overconfidence and impaired risk assessment. The opioids remove the emotional signals that would normally trigger caution. Together, they produce a mental state where a person feels supremely capable and certain, while their actual judgment is severely compromised. Researchers at universities across Europe and America have used computer modeling to simulate how Hitler's brain chemistry would have functioned under the influence of his daily pharmaceutical cocktail. The models incorporate what we now know about drug interactions, tolerance development, and the cumulative effects of long-term substance abuse. The results are sobering. The simulations suggest that by 1943, Hitler's brain had undergone fundamental changes. Chronic methamphetamine exposure damages dopamine neurons, creating persistent alterations in motivation and reward processing. Chronic opioid use changes pain perception and emotional regulation in ways that persist even during periods of abstinence. The combination produces what researchers describe as profound executive function impairment, difficulty with planning, impulse control, and adaptive decision-making. Think about what this means for military leadership. A commander must assess complex information, weigh multiple factors, anticipate enemy responses, and make decisions that balance risk against potential gain. These are precisely the cognitive functions most impaired by the drugs Hitler was taking. The simulations suggest that his decision-making capability may have been reduced by 30 to 50% compared to baseline function. New documentary evidence has emerged from unexpected sources. In 2007, Russian archives released previously classified material, including additional pages from Morell's personal notes. These documents had been captured by Soviet forces in the bunker, but kept secret during the Cold War. They revealed pharmaceutical details that even Western intelligence agencies had not fully understood. The Russian documents showed that Morell had been experimenting with even more exotic preparations than previously known: testosterone and other hormone treatments, substances extracted from animal organs, following pseudoscientific theories popular in 1930s medicine. Even more disturbing, the note suggested that Morell had sometimes increased doses without Hitler's knowledge, adjusting the pharmaceutical cocktail based on his own observations of what produced the desired effects. This revelation added another dimension to understanding the relationship. Hitler was not simply a willing addict. He was, at least partially, a victim of medical manipulation by a physician who had lost all ethical boundaries. Morell had become so focused on maintaining his position and satisfying his patient that he was effectively conducting an uncontrolled pharmaceutical experiment on the leader of Nazi Germany. Forensic analysis of Hitler's behavior patterns has become increasingly sophisticated. Researchers have catalogued thousands of Hitler's decisions, statements, and actions throughout the war years. They have then correlated these with known pharmaceutical administration schedules extracted from Morell's logs. Patterns emerge that are difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Periods of elevated drug use correlate with periods of particularly erratic decision-making. Days when Morell's notes indicate multiple injections of stimulants correspond to military conferences, where witnesses reported Hitler making especially aggressive or unrealistic strategic demands. Conversely, periods when medical issues forced temporary reduction in drug doses coincide with moments when Hitler appeared more rational and willing to consider alternatives. One research team focused specifically on Hitler's public speeches, analyzing speech patterns, word choice, and delivery style across hundreds of hours of recorded material. They found systematic changes over time that match what would be expected from chronic stimulant abuse. Early speeches showed varied pacing and emotional range. Later speeches became more repetitive, more fixated on particular phrases, more disconnected from logical argument structure. The deterioration in coherent communication parallels the escalation in pharmaceutical intervention. Modern understanding of addiction provides context that earlier generations lacked. We now recognize addiction as a medical condition affecting brain chemistry rather than a moral failing. This framework allows us to understand Hitler's pharmaceutical dependency without excusing the crimes committed under his leadership. The drugs impaired his judgment, but they did not create his ideology or absolve him of responsibility for implementing genocidal policies. Neuroscientists have also examined the specific claim that withdrawal from the drugs might have been worse than continuing them. By 1943, Hitler had been using high doses of stimulants and opioids for years. His brain chemistry had adapted to their constant presence. Sudden cessation would have produced severe withdrawal symptoms, anxiety, depression, physical pain, profound fatigue, and potentially life-threatening medical complications. This creates a tragic irony. Even if someone had recognized the full extent of Hitler's addiction and attempted intervention, the withdrawal process would have temporarily incapacitated him at a time when Germany needed coherent leadership. The pharmaceutical trap was complete. Continuing the drugs impaired his judgment, Stopping them would have rendered him temporarily unable to function at all. There was no good option remaining, only a choice between different forms of impairment. Recent analysis has also examined the broader context of pharmaceutical use in Nazi Germany. Hitler was not the only person in the Third Reich using performance-enhancing drugs. German military forces consumed millions of Pervitin tablets during the early war years. The pharmaceutical industry actively marketed methamphetamine as a tool for increasing productivity and overcoming fatigue. Hitler's addiction occurred within a culture that saw drugs as technological solutions to human limitations. This cultural context helps explain why so few people around Hitler recognized his condition or intervened. In a society where military and civilian populations were using stimulants, Hitler's pharmaceutical dependence did not seem as aberrant as it would in a different context. The normalization of drug use in Nazi Germany made it easier for Hitler's addiction to progress unnoticed or unremarked upon by those around him. Perhaps the most powerful modern analysis comes from simply watching Hitler's decline with informed eyes. Historians and medical professionals have created annotated timelines showing film footage of Hitler at different points in the war, alongside information about his pharmaceutical regimen at those times. The correlation between drug escalation and visible deterioration is unmistakable. Here is Hitler in 1939, moving with confidence, speaking with energy, his hands steady. His pharmaceutical use at this point is still relatively modest. Now watch footage from 1943. The tremor is obvious. His movements are stiffer. His facial expressions show reduced range. The drugs that were supposed to be enhancing his capabilities are visibly destroying his nervous system. By 1945, the deterioration is so severe that he appears decades older than his actual age. Modern science has given us the tools to understand what happened to Hitler with a precision that would have been impossible even 20 years ago. We can map the drug interactions in his brain. We can model the cognitive effects. We can correlate pharmaceutical schedules with behavior patterns. We can analyze his physical deterioration with forensic detail. And from all of this analysis, one conclusion emerges with absolute clarity. Adolf Hitler conducted World War II while suffering from severe, progressive drug addiction that fundamentally impaired his ability to lead. This knowledge changes how we must understand that terrible period of history. It does not excuse what happened. Nothing can do that. But it adds a crucial dimension to our comprehension of how one of history's greatest catastrophes unfolded. The human brain, altered by chemicals, making decisions that affected millions of lives, the tragedy of addiction playing out at the highest levels of power, with consequences measured in continents and generations. Stand back now and consider the full scope of what we have uncovered. The revelation of Hitler's drug addiction fundamentally reshapes our understanding of World War II's pivotal moments. This is not simply an interesting historical footnote. This is a reframing of how we comprehend one of humanity's darkest chapters. Every major decision Hitler made from 1941 onward occurred in a brain saturated with methamphetamine, opioids, cocaine, and barbiturates. The invasion of the Soviet Union, the declaration of war on the United States, the refusal to allow strategic retreats, the declaration, insistence on holding positions that could not be held, the increasingly paranoid purges of competent commanders. All of it filtered through consciousness that bore no resemblance to normal human judgment. Think about the counterfactual possibilities. What if Hitler had received proper medical care instead of Morell's pharmaceutical cocktails? What if his stomach problems had been treated with appropriate therapy rather than with escalating doses of narcotics? What if someone with authority had recognized his addiction and intervened? The war might have ended differently, perhaps sooner, potentially with fewer casualties. We can never know, but the questions themselves are profound. This revelation places Hitler in a broader historical context of leaders whose substance abuse affected their governance. He was not the first, nor would he be the last. Consider Anthony Eden, British Prime Minister during the Suez Crisis, who was taking amphetamines for medical reasons, and whose judgment during that crucial period has been questioned. Consider John F. Kennedy, whose chronic pain led to pharmaceutical treatments that may have influenced decision-making during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The pattern repeats throughout history. Leaders in pain or stress seeking chemical solutions, often with inadequate medical oversight. But Hitler's case stands apart in scale and consequence. Other addicted leaders made mistakes, some serious. Hitler's impaired judgment contributed to decisions that killed millions. The scope of the tragedy he enabled, combined with the severity of his pharmaceutical dependency, creates a historical case study unlike any other. This is addiction intersecting with absolute power during total war, and the results devastated a continent. There is a bitter irony worth contemplating. The Nazi ideology obsessed over racial purity, physical perfection, and the elimination of those deemed genetically inferior. The regime murdered disabled people in the T4 euthanasia program, claiming they polluted the German gene pool. It implemented genocidal policies based on pseudo-scientific theories of racial hierarchy. Yet the Führer himself, the supposed embodiment of Aryan supremacy, was utterly dependent on drugs to function. More ironic still, many of the pharmaceutical preparations Hitler received were developed by German Jewish chemists and physicians before they were driven from the country. The methamphetamine he depended on had been synthesized by researchers the Nazi ideology claimed were racially inferior. The antibiotics that treated his infections came from scientific traditions the regime attempted to destroy. Hitler's survival depended on the very medical and scientific communities his government persecuted. Theodor Morell himself adds another layer to this irony. While not Jewish, he had Jewish colleagues and had trained in medical traditions that Nazi ideology condemned as degenerate. The chemicals flowing into Hitler's veins represented cosmopolitan European medicine, not the mystical folk remedies that some Nazi ideologues preferred. The champion of German purity was being kept alive by the very international scientific community he sought to eliminate. What does this teach us about power and vulnerability? Hitler projected an image of strength, of will made manifest, of superhuman determination. The propaganda machine portrayed him as Germany's savior, a leader of unprecedented vision and capability. Yet beneath this carefully constructed facade was a man so dependent on pharmaceutical intervention that he could not function without multiple daily injections. The projection of strength masked profound weakness. This pattern appears throughout history. Leaders feel compelled to project invincibility while privately struggling with very human frailties. The demands of leadership create stress that drives some toward chemical solutions. The isolation of power makes intervention difficult, as subordinates fear challenging the leader's choices. The cycle reinforces itself. Stress leads to drug use impairs judgment, impaired judgment creates more stress. Hitler's case reveals the danger of allowing any individual to accumulate unchecked power. If other doctors had been permitted to examine him independently, if his medical care had been subject to oversight, if his inner circle had been willing to challenge his pharmaceutical dependency, the situation might have been different. But totalitarian systems concentrate power precisely to prevent such checks and balances. The very political structure that enabled Hitler's rise also enabled his addiction to progress unchecked. Consider, too, what this reveals about the human factors that shape history. We often analyze historical events in terms of ideology, economics, military capability, and strategic calculation. These factors matter enormously, but we sometimes forget that history is ultimately made by human beings with human bodies and brains that can be influenced by chemistry. A leader's migraine, a general's sleepless night, a diplomat's pain medication. These personal physical factors can influence decisions that affect millions. Hitler's addiction represents an extreme case of this principle. His pharmaceutical dependency did not create Nazi ideology or invent concentration camps, but it may have influenced how aggressively policies were pursued, how rigid strategic thinking became, how unwilling he was to accept facts that contradicted his drugged perception of reality. The intersection of personal chemistry and historical catastrophe teaches us to consider the full range of factors, including the very human and physical ones, that shape events. The story also illuminates the nature of enablement and addiction. Morel did not intend to create a severely addicted patient. He intended to provide effective medical care, to maintain his position, to satisfy his patient's demands. Each step seemed justifiable at the time. Each escalation appeared necessary given the previous decisions. This is how enabling works, through incremental choices that seem reasonable individually but create catastrophe collectively. Anyone who has watched a loved one struggle with addiction will recognize the pattern. The initial treatment that seems helpful, the gradual escalation as tolerance develops, the denials and rationalizations, the defensive protection of the source that provides the drugs, the deterioration that everyone can see but few dare to name. Hitler and Morel's relationship followed the same trajectory as countless other stories of addiction and enabling, but played out on history's largest stage. What responsibility do we assign? Hitler bears ultimate responsibility for the crimes committed under his authority. No amount of pharmaceutical impairment excuses genocide or aggressive war. But Morel bears responsibility too for medical malpractice that reached criminal proportions, for enabling an addiction that harmed not just his patient but the world, for allowing ambition and fear to override medical judgment. And what of those around Hitler who suspected but said nothing? The generals who noticed his deteriorating judgment but continued following orders? The inner circle members who witnessed the injections but never questioned their propriety? They too share responsibility for allowing the situation to continue. Silence in the face of obvious impairment enables catastrophe. Looking forward, what lessons does this history offer? First, that leaders need independent medical oversight. No single physician should control a leader's healthcare without peer review and transparency. Second, that substances affecting consciousness should be prescribed with extreme caution to anyone making decisions that affect others. Third, that political systems must include mechanisms for addressing leader impairment, whether from drugs, illness, or age. More broadly, this history teaches humility about human judgment. We like to think that important decisions are made by rational actors, carefully weighing options. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they are made by exhausted, stressed, chemically altered human beings doing their best in impossible circumstances. Understanding this does not excuse poor decisions, but it might make us more careful about how we structure decision-making processes and support those bearing heavy responsibilities. The chemical shadow over World War II cannot be removed from history. We cannot rerun the war with a sober Hitler and see if outcomes would have differed, but we can understand that what happened was influenced not just by ideology and strategy, but by the interaction of powerful drugs with a human brain making decisions about millions of lives. This knowledge does not simplify history. It complicates it, adding layers of causation and contingency that make the past both more understandable and more tragic. In the end, we return to those 783 medications discovered in the bunker, to Morel's hidden logs, to the testimony of witnesses who watched Hitler deteriorate. These fragments of evidence have given us a new lens through which to view a period we thought we understood. The lens reveals that behind the grand narratives of ideology and conflict were very human stories of pain, dependency, and the desperate search for chemical solutions to unbearable pressures. Hitler's drug addiction does not explain everything about World War II, but it explains something important that we did not fully understand before. It reminds us that history is shaped not just by ideas and forces, but by bodies and brains and the chemicals that flow through them. and it stands as a warning about what happens when addiction intersects with power, when enablement goes unchallenged, and when the very human frailty of leaders is hidden behind projections of strength. The war ended 80 years ago, but its lessons continue to resonate. Among those lessons is this: pay attention to the human factors. Watch for signs of impairment in those wielding power. Create systems that allow intervention when leaders' judgment becomes compromised. And never forget that behind the great movements of history are individual human beings, vulnerable to all the weaknesses that flesh is heir to, including the terrible vulnerability to addiction that can turn strength into weakness and clarity into confusion. The chemical shadow remains visible across history, teaching us, warning us, reminding us of the full complexity of the human experience, even in its darkest chapters.